What I saw recently, Trump giving this talk in the UAE.
The birth of a modern Middle East has been brought by the people of the region themselves. In the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built. You achieved a modern miracle, the Arabian way. That's a good way.
What Trump was saying was they're very successful, and it didn't require us to come in and tell you how to do it. And you did it in a different way to the way that we did it. And that's okay. I don't think people realize how much profound shift that statement is. Because really what you're saying is like all the fundamental things that we value as a society are not necessarily the only way to do it. And so dies the moral universalist project. So I guess I kind of want to like develop a little bit on your point there, because you mentioned how Peterson was the kind of link between the rational and the religious. To be honest, in my opinion, I think Tom Holland for me did a better job. I mean, maybe I was already primed by Peterson, but like I think Tom Holland for me did a better job of demonstrating how the kind of value hierarchy that I hold to be the correct one, the set of moral principles that I value to be the ones that to have come ultimately from like a religious framework. I guess like to make the leap from there to actually being religious is one that I kind of can't make. But yeah, I think Tom Holland did a better job, in my opinion.
I think it depends what the purpose of their um writings or their like the information that they're trying to share with us is, like what the purpose is, because Tom Holland doesn't contend with at all any of the actual individual stories of the Bible. He is more of like a um uh he's more explaining more like the meta sort of functionalities of Christianity and how it's operated within the West, from a sort of like high level standpoint. Like he describes, the journeys that Paul took and the influence that Paul had, but he doesn't really. Whereas Jordan Peterson is more actually dissecting stories of the Bible and trying to share and explain how those impacted our Western culture, rather than a very high level. I think, but I agree with you. I think Tom Holland very effective at basically being able to ground um, the impact that Christianity's had in the world, not through a theological lens, but through a sort of more objective, analytical lens.
They definitely got two different goals.
Yeah.
I suppose I just found Tom Holland's work more like better for me to kind of understand all these ways in which, the way I act and the things I value are already pretty Christian in and of themselves, if you know what I mean. Um,
Yeah.
like Rome, um, and kind of other civilizations that came before. And it just shows you just how weird the set of like values that the West has are
Mhm.
with respect to like the law of the jungle or the might is right or like Nazism, which is obviously kind of the biggest repudiation of Christian values we've had in the West ever. Like well, fascism in general, I guess. Um, so yeah, I think for me it was kind of he helped me get there better to the extent where I've actually got friends who are trying to set up churches.
Yeah.
Like a friend of mine that
Mhm.
and I told him like you need to understand the Tom Holland train. Like you need to understand because I think you need to understand this book, what it's saying, because I think a lot of the people that you will encounter, like young, kind of curious, thoughtful people, will have read this book and they probably will want to talk about it, you know?
Yeah, I think in thinking about it, Tom Holland basically says this Christianity was so influential in shaping our Western culture, and this is why it was so influential because of what is at the core of the Christian message. But then Jordan Peterson, where he differs, is that he basically says how this was influential. So he goes more into the human psyche and the sort of psychological elements of Christianity and how that might impact the individual. Whereas I don't think Tom Holland really contends with the individual's experience with Christianity. He's more talking about Western culture as a collective.
It's a fair point. Speaking of all these topics, um, I would say that one of the core tenets of Western moral philosophy has been backwards and forwards a sense of like universalism that especially at kind of the earlier evangelical days, I think the Victorians are probably the high mark potentially for this, and maybe the kind of late modern Americans as well. Um, this sense that we have the right moral framework and this is the way things should be. And it's our duty to evangelize and to spread this moral framework across the globe. And you see this, I mean, in a sense, with Britain ending the slave trade in like the 1800s, and the moral force they used and the force they used with their navy to enforce that across global trade and kind of stamping out the slave trade globally. It wasn't a case of, oh, like a relativistic thing, right? Whereas like, okay, well, you guys are fine to have slaves over there, and we just don't want to be implicated. It was like, no, we don't want any slave boats on the oceans at all because we have the power to do it, and that's the moral thing to do, right? And then you have even the setting up of the UN by Eleanor Roosevelt in particular, codifying the Charter of Human Rights, which reads like a very Christian set of human rights that are completely contingent on the moral developments of Christianity in Western society from the Enlightenment forward, even included, and would be alien to someone from, say, rural China or India, where because of contingency, they have a completely separate set of values. I'm not saying there's not other ways you can arrive at those values, but all I'm saying is that this was completely contingent on the West being this Christian society. And again, the universalism point where it's like, this is the Bill of Human Rights that applies to the whole globe now, It's an implied set of these are the moral rights, that these are the right things to have, that every person should be entitled to. And, we will use the UN to enforce that. And you even see this in the last 20, 30 years when you have the US going in to try build a liberal democracy in Iraq or Afghanistan, which is a laughable thing to do in both in like looking forward and in retrospect, because the amount of contingent things that have to happen to set up your society to have the kind of cultural cachet to allow the institutions to be built to allow a democratic society are, again, like, I'm not saying democracy can't exist in those places, but like it takes a lot of things to go right in a certain way, part of which has to be the set of religious facts that people held to be true in the West to build like a democracy there, right? And so they went there with their guns and their money, and they said, we're going to try and make Afghanistan a liberal democracy with a written constitution. And it obviously didn't work because there's nothing in their culture, not nothing, but there's very like few like kind of holding on points for these ideas to take root in the intellectual landscape of Afghani people. It's just a very different way of viewing the world, of viewing even things like individuality are completely different. Things is like, and the more you take these things for granted, the harder it is to see you take them for granted because it's just invisible to you. It's not even, it's such a baseline assumption that you don't even realize you assume it. And I think this is all to say what I saw recently, Trump giving this talk in the UAE about essentially what he was saying was, we admire the societies you've built. They were built without kind of us coming in and having to do it for you. They're clearly prosperous at some levels. I mean, Trump was very effusive. He loved these places, and there's obviously critiques you can lay against these places. But what Trump was saying was, they're very successful, and they didn't require us to come in and tell you how to do it. And you did it in a different way to the way that we did it. And that's okay. And a lot of people have been agreeing with this because obviously Iraq, Afghanistan, these have been insanely bad ideas and they were never going to work either. And the flipping mentally has been basically saying, you can build a society that's different to ours, and that's okay. And I actually kind of agree with this as well, by the way, because I don't think you can take something that's developed because of a whole bunch of contingencies and drop that into another place and expect it to work. It has to come from within the framework from which it's growing. But I don't think people realize how much of a profound shift that statement is, and everyone kind of broadly agreeing with it is, because really what you're saying is like, all the fundamental things that we value as a society are not necessarily the only way to do it. And so dies the Universalist project, the moral universalist project, because you're basically conceding that your morals that you hold to be like profound and true, and the way the institutions and structures that you want to use to build like what you consider to be the ideal society are not universal. That there are other ways of doing it, and that's okay. And I guess I was just shocked that how quietly this happened, and it's been a long trend, basically starting from the most evangelical people back in the 1600s, trying to spread civilization, commerce, and Christianity as their like explicit goals. Even the jingoistic times of the US taking over the Philippines and Cuba and stuff, and they're trying to spread their way of doing things. So now people saying, actually, there's lots of ways of doing things. It doesn't have to be ours, as long as we're friends. So I just think this is like a really profound shift in Western thinking, and everyone just seems to have fallen in line because of the disastrous projects we've had recently of trying to convert countries to Western liberal democracy.
It's really interesting. I just want to ask you, when you said it doesn't matter how we both arrive at the sort of stability of the nation as long as we're friends, do you think that what's missing from what you've said is also as long as we're both financially prosperous as well? Because I feel like that's basically the point of synergy between the two leaders, is that Trump sees the Middle East as a prospering subcontinent, and so therefore the sort of the societies that they've been able to establish are therefore good, rather than it being purely based on anything else. Really, I can't help but see it through a financial sort of capitalist lens, that as long as they've got those in common, then sort of anything else sort of goes.
I completely agree. If they weren't as financially successful as they are, then it wouldn't be the same story. They wouldn't have the military regional kind of power that they do now, because they wouldn't have the weapons, they wouldn't have the intellectual capital. Um, and but I think it's worth saying that like what they have done is impressive to a degree, right? Just because you have like a wealth of natural resources doesn't necessarily imply that you're going to be a prosperous country. I mean,
Well, Russia, good example.
there's countless examples. There's actually something called the resource curse. The resource curse is the idea that if you find a huge amount of natural resources like oil in your country, that can lead to, especially a country that lends towards corruption, that can cause outside forces to want to keep your country in a state of disarray so that they can rape your natural resources and steal all your. So look at Sierra Leone, for example. They found a bunch of diamonds. And because Sierra Leone was already an unstable country, international capital and rogue governments were financing civil wars in Sierra Leone to keep it in a state of disarray so they could take all the diamonds and the natural resources.
But you know the natural pushback to someone hearing what you've just said is that that's not the real reason why those countries are basically in disarray. But all those countries that you mentioned are ex-colonies of European powers, and that it was those colonies. It was because they were ex-colonies of European powers that they were sort of left, with so much disregard when the European nations sort of left those countries in the middle of the 20th century. That it's not necessarily the fault of the people, the sort of natives, that it was basically the European colonizers came, they were in charge of everything, they separated their business and their enterprises from the natives, and that when they left there was basically power vacuums, and that's what basically caused the corruption. Because like you say, you can't build societies top down, they have to come from the bottom up. But in the particular case of the British Empire, they never did any building from the bottom up. They were completely, all their enterprises were sort of segmented and separated from the native peoples. They didn't really integrate much with the natives, and so then when they left, there was a power vacuum, and it was up to the natives to figure out, well, what should they do then with all these natural resources, with these businesses that had once been instantiated but now sort of left destitute.
It's a good point. And one question I think that will increasingly come up, and this is a pretty edgy thing to say, is as the power of the West fades and wanes, how long after decolonization, like in terms of like number of years, are you still going to be allowed to say this is the fault of the decolonization process? Because let's say that there are plenty of countries that were colonies that have done well or started to build themselves up. Like Rwanda is a good example, or Kenya, I think, is on the way up. And there's this kind of this like differential success between countries. Some countries do really well, and some countries do less well. And there's very little like geographic determinism, let's say, because at some level, whether you do well or not is a set of policy choices, right? And it depends on the policies that the people you elect, if you're a democracy, enact. It's not the case in the UAE, for example. So I wonder, like, how long this is. If you have two countries next to each other, for example, Kenya and Uganda, and one does really well and the other one doesn't, can you really blame the decolonization process in Uganda for what's going on there? I mean, ultimately, if you're doing a root cause analysis and you go back, butterfly effect, that will always be a part of the conversation. But Yeah, I think you see what I'm getting at.
I definitely, and that's a sort of theme that reoccurs in basically every aspect of human life. And when you said that, the first thing that pops into my head is, for a Christian, like how long after uh Genesis do you blame the snake in the Garden of Eden for basically causing the first sin? Like that is a sort of it's a cliche, or not necessarily cliche, but it's a theme that keeps on coming up over and over time. And Christians contend with it all the time about the initial act of sin, and it was because of that moment that had this knock-on effect that meant that humans had inherent sin, and that we were basically on a quest forever to absolve ourselves from that sin. So I think that's just part of being a human, is that you're always going to find and always going to resort back to the very first instance that you can find where corruption uh, was acted, and then it's up to you basically to work and create processes and create rituals and traditions, and to create new sustainable frameworks that are going to sort of counteract to this inherent sin that is the colonization of these countries, by European nations. I think it's always going to be part of these countries' history, and it doesn't absolve them of responsibility, essentially. And that's what the Bible teaches us, is that there's this sin, this corruption, this bad act that happens at the beginning, but then what happens is that it's up to the human beings then to always sort of try and fight against that temptation, henceforth. So yeah, countries like Uganda are always going to be, blaming the ex-colonies, sorry, their ex-colonizers, but doesn't absolve them of any responsibility. Essentially, it's still up to them to sort it out.
I think another good example of this is Botswana versus um, Zimbabwe, which are two more countries that border each other. And Botswana had some very thoughtful leadership immediately post transition, post independence, that were very careful to marshal their resources and extract the value they could from their diamond trade and invest money in educating the next generation of the population. Whereas Zimbabwe went down a much more kind of socialist, communist, Afrocentric Marxist route. And again, there's very little in terms of like the geographic determinism you could say from these two countries. It's very hard not to lay the relative worse offness of Zimbabwe at the feet of bad policy choices that the government made versus Botswana, where again it's not the most prosperous country in the world, but for like from a pragmatic perspective, they've done really well given the kind of shock of what happened to their kind of country over the last 200 years. So, and I guess we should be interested in the differences between why some countries do better than others, right? Because if you can abstract why, another great example of this is like the US Mexican border, where you got one town that's like in Arizona, and it's actually a big town, and the border cuts through the middle of the town. And the town on the US side has functioning courts, functioning schools. The GDP per capita is like three times higher. Um, and then the town on the Mexican side of the border has like a high murder rate. You're very unlikely to get justice if a crime is committed against you. Um, I find that fascinating because all the geographical, ethnic, kind of, even to a large degree, like population uh, level, like things are exactly the same. And there's just this imaginary line through which, I mean, obviously now it's an actual line, it's a fence, but like this line and what that line represents is a different like culture or a different
Mhm.
institution, and that line is contrived in our heads. But on either side of that line, everything is different. Your daughter is much less likely to get murdered or whatever. On one side of that line, the other.
So how do you reconcile that fact that you've just shared with the differences between the two terms and what Trump said in his speech at the UAE, where he talks about how, well, what you were saying about how it's okay about how you arrive um, at a certain level of prosperity. It's the differences in culture don't matter, because that's a good example of where cultures do matter.
And I would never say there's one way to get somewhere. And that's the value of creativity, right? It's like finding different ways to get to positive outcomes. There are obviously things about the Middle East that I disagree with. Um, and I think one critique you can make against systems like that in general is that because it's very top down, and this is something you could say about China as well, right? Um, and there's like a very centralized process of policy setting. Um, you can do good things quickly, but you can also do bad things quickly. And so if every system of government will make mistakes, basically. But it's like, what's the error correction mechanism is what I'm
Mhm.
getting at. Um, and you could end up with an unwise ruler. You could end up with, um, you know, a situation where egos get on the line. And then it's very hard to correct that error. And so I don't know if over the long term, the very long term, that game is less well adapted than the game of the kind of the evolutionary process of policy discovery that Western countries go through. And obviously, Western countries are in like a down right now. And I think um, the error correction mechanism is still there. I just think we haven't had anywhere, for example, in the UK, good enough leadership to kind of grapple with the cultural heritage. By that, I mean like the system of government we actually have, and how it actually works. Um, and I also just think there's a general weird thing that goes on where, and this is a big ramble, um, there's a fear of new ideas. And I think you see this down to even like the type of MP that exists. There's actually quite like very little diversity within, and I don't mean like kind of ethnic diversity, I mean like experience and professional background and university degree. Like, I don't think it's that strange at this day and age to expect to see someone in the cabinet who's written a line of code in their life, you know? Um, and so tying this back to the point, like there are different ways of getting there. I happen to think the way we have is the best way over the long term. And partly that's because it's been around for a long time and there's a Lindy effect there. You could probably date roughly our system, and it's obviously had a lot of like tampering with over the years, but to Walpole, um, or even like the Glorious Revolution, like obviously it's changed a huge amount. Different people have been given the vote, different people, there's different rules about aristocracy and stuff. But largely speaking, there's been like kind of some like longitudinal evidence here. And there's almost no kind of autocracies or kind of very top-down societies that are still around that started in that period of time for whatever reason. And
Mhm.
maybe we're going to be shown to be vestigial in evolutionary terms, right? Maybe our way of doing things is going to ultimately be borne out to be the wrong way because in the evolutionary search space of political structures, lots of people trying lots of different things, and certain structures get better feedback from reality than others, and those will tend to propagate themselves. Um, but yeah, I mean, maybe we'll be the ones that kind of get relegated to history.
It's interesting. Do you think that countries like the US have a moral obligation to call out other nations when they perceive them as doing something immoral? Because just to the sort of allude to your earlier point about the sort of breakdown of universal morals, um,
How immoral?
how immoral is that? Is that
Are we talking like genocide, or are we talking like, um, you know, uh, indentured servitude? Are we talking, um, so
well? It's an interesting question. I think that if it was, for example, imagine a world where the death penalty was abolished, and that was the moral standpoint. Sorry, that was the moral that everyone agreed on that, and that was the sort of objective morality of the world was that death penalty is wrong. No one should be put to death. But then there was one country that said, "Well, actually, we believe in the death penalty, and we have all these good reasons why we want to have the death penalty as policy." Do you think that other countries can say whether or not this country, this sovereign country, can have the death penalty or not?
um, well, the US has the death penalty, right? So
Yeah, in some states, yeah. Some states don't.
um, I don't think they'd be upset about the death penalty as much as they'd be upset about the legal process through which you decide who's allowed to die or not.
Okay. But assuming like everything was, up to scratch, like there was a very rigorous process. My point is that is it the responsibility of a larger power to ensure that smaller powers are um, adhering to a certain standard of morality?
I think it depends on the nature of the crime being committed or the immorality, let's say. I just don't see a world where even as the US shirks its responsibility as um, the hegemon more and more, they will start to be okay with a country like brutally genociding, um, you know, uh, and this has happened a few times um, through the years, um, and I just don't see a situation in which the US won't be morally outraged. Like in a way, like on both the left and the right, moral outrage is like a currency in the US. They're both very moralistic, and for both of them, it's actually really strange as well. So I think people from other cultures where there's much more focus on like, is your house in order versus what are other people doing?
Mm.
Um, I think one of the competitive advantage, for example, the Chinese have had over the US is that they've just been willing to work with regimes the US for moral reasons wouldn't lend money to, or And again, maybe that's for good reasons as well, right?
So imagine China is the superpower in World War II, and they are the ones who, um, along with the Soviet Union, have defeated Germany, and they're now they now have this choice whether to hold the top Nazi officials to account and hold them responsible for their actions. Do you think the Nuremberg trials happen under China's leadership?
Yes. And I think because those weren't just about what happened in those Polish camps, it was also about killing so many people, right? Like the Russians were as motivated as everyone else to hold those top German generals to account because the sheer amount of Russians that have been slaughtered because of the war. And also, I think in particular, when the war that was being waged is like a racist war, like it was against the Slavs, a war of extermination. And I guess like it probably would have been a similar level of rhetoric against the Chinese, right?
Mm.
Um, I actually don't know what the Nazis thought about the Chinese, to be fair. But assuming that was the case, I definitely think they would have, and it wouldn't have been on. It would have been the moral grounds of you killed all our people, we want to hang you regardless, you know. But obviously, you put it in the tones of on a moral basis. What axioms do you think we have incorrect right now?
Um, I think you'll agree with me, but I think that we haven't figured out how first the last should be. I think that's something that we haven't figured out yet. I think that there's this innate, it feels innate in like the UK. I'm sure people in the US would agree. It feels like whenever you're met with someone that is in desperate need and is in a very impoverished situation, that the right thing to do has to be to help them. It just has to, like, there's no way that you could possibly conceive where you're just not helping this person. And I feel that really strongly. I feel like, um, definitely when I'm in public as well, that need is more manifested. I guess when I'm just on my own, I can be more selfish and, um, yeah, more reluctant to help people. But certainly when I'm in, the public sphere, I, um, like to express my, yeah, my sort of need, or my wishes to help other people. I think that's something that we haven't figured out right, because clearly this isn't working for us. I mean, just look at the issue that we're having with immigration at the moment in the UK. Like, that is obviously a problem. Everyone knows it's a problem. I think we're far past the time where it's sort of controversial to say it's an issue now. Like, I think everyone agrees, and the fact that like Labour have now said it, that they're going to start doing something about it after Reform obviously, like, swept up all the councils in the recent election. It was a sort of signal to Labour, which is like, okay, like, we can't ignore this issue now. This is a real problem, and it's sort of allowing us to recognise it's a problem. But then, how does that work in practice? And I think that our culture doesn't have those principles in place for us to really make a, if we want to use sort of terminology that we've just spoken about, we don't have the right seed for the framework yet in order to cope with the migration problem.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of tied to another theological framing of that point, which is neither Jew nor Greek, right? Which is like a line Paul would say. It's like there's neither Jew nor Greek in Christ. Basically, it's like we're all That's actually a point of universalism as well, right? It's like um, every everyone is a brother in Christ, basically, and that's another core tension, right? The kind of migration point where it's like, um, yeah, I mean, you kind of laid out very nicely there. I guess you put this like point in theological terms, right? How first should the last be? Do you think it's a theological argument? I heard a really interesting, by the way, it's a bit of a tangent, but I think it's kind of relevant. Um, and someone was talking about the three great religions of the world, and they've said the three great religions of the world are Christianity, Islam, and communism. And they were talking about communism and they were just very nonchalant talking about it as like a religion. And I think it does fill a lot of the niche of religious thought, right? Um, it gets you to reject all other religious thoughts and adopt it primarily. It has this like community building aspect to it. Um, it's like a lot of like axiomatic like foundational ways communism is behaves very much like a religion.
Apart from one major thing that we've just spoken about, and that is its inability to mirror reality.
It's fundamentally not aligned with reality, is your point.
Yeah, it's not. I can totally see how Islam might be. Um, can't I think the principles of communism just completely contradict human reality.
Human nature, especially.
Human nature, that's what I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So, um, so it's a bit of a tangent. I guess kind of my point being that if how first should the last be is kind of a theological argument, and communism is one logical extreme of that, and in it in and of itself becomes kind of like this proto-religious memeplex, let's say, then is it just doomed to be like a theological argument and we like have to think of it in theological terms? Um, because yeah, the Nazis are the other side of that, right? Like the last should be completely last.
Mm.
And I don't know if fascism is a religion in the way that communism is.
Yeah, I think it yeah. I think a religion, the thing that distinguishes religions are the things that you worship and the things that you value. And so basically what you worship is basically that which you prioritize, that you tend to, that you are willing to sacrifice for. And these are the things that differentiate religions. The and another way of saying that is basically what are the core values basically at the heart of each of these moral frameworks. And I think, yes, fascism can be considered a religion because it has a set of values at its core, and it also makes its subjects worship something, which is basically how would you define fascism? What, national socialism? I don't know. But basically it makes you like put, this is what I was saying earlier about like what do you value more? Do you value the nation more than its subjects? And I think fascism is a clear framework where one of its values is that the nation comes first before the people, and I think that is basically a thing that differentiates it between other frameworks. So I think it has elements that make it, a kind of religion. It's not a full religion, and it's not a religion in the fullest sense, because it does obviously miss a lot of things that we commonly believe religions to have. For example, like a god or a supernatural sort of being in it or whatever. But I guess Buddhism is considered a religion, and that doesn't have any supernatural beings. So it's if I think if you can consider Buddhism a religion, then you can also consider fascism a religion.
Yeah, I I I struggle with Buddhism because it's so different to the other religions.
Mm.
It's so even from Hinduism, although a lot of the insights ultimately end up in pointing in similar directions. I almost struggle to consider it of the same category as something like Christianity or Islam or um, other kind of world religions.
Well, this is the fascinating thing about Dominion, is that it really uh, made me think about what I'd consider a religion, and I don't, and I think I agree with you. I don't know if I would even consider Islam and Christianity in the same category anymore, because Islam clearly doesn't have any issue with separating that which is Caesar's from that which is God's. Like from an Islamic perspective, they're both, they can be intertwined. You can have a state that's run by religious leaders, but from a Christian perspective, that is not. They're incompatible. They're not incompatible. They should be yeah. The nation should be secularized.
It's almost like it's a definition. Sorry, it's defined by that in which it is in contrast to. It doesn't exist except in contrast. A religion doesn't exist except in contrast to the state.
I think an analogy would be, and I learned this from QI, an episode of QI, and uh, and it was that there's no such thing as a fish, basically. I don't know if you remember, if you saw this, but basically there's no one thing about any organism in the sea that makes it a fish. Like, you can have two sort of things that you think are fish, but they're genetically like so unrelated, and like we'd be way more genetically closer to the trout than we are to the salmon, for example. And so, what does that make us fish as well, if we were like closer? Or if you want to define fish as like that which has fins and swims, then you've got dolphins that are mammals, and they don't fit the definition. So there's no way of like actually saying definitively what a fish is, and it's kind of like that with religions. Like, there's just, each one is so differentiated and like unique in its own way, and has different attributes, that to say that they're all religions is a fallacy.
This just reminded me of something fascinating I read a while back, which is, and this is more biological because we're talking about evolution. There is no such, lichens.
No, I don't.
A lichen is, when you see a fence and you see like kind of thin, pale thing growing on a fence,
No, what is?
a piece of wood,
How do you spell it?
Lichin, lichen
Okay,
or
okay,
en.
okay, got it. Yeah.
Um, Lichens are fascinating because they're formed by the spontaneous combination of fungi and algae, and they resist any attempts to define what a species is. Because for us, a species is this like discrete occurrence of an organism that is like genetically dissimilar enough from other organisms they can't kind of intermingle and breed and stuff. Lichens are a spontaneous species, and random fungi and algae of like thousands of different types can spontaneously form new associations that make it one organism. And therefore, there's no clear boundary of this is a species and this is that is a species, because they spontaneously form and fall out of this relationship that makes them kind of what a single unitary organism. And so this kind of confounds the whole by like even concept of like defining what a species is, and because it's so spontaneous, and random and different every time. Um, yeah.
I think just to sort of close the loop then on that question that you asked me about what's something that we've got wrong or that we've not accounted for necessarily in our in our initial values, perhaps Western's Christian values. And my answer, one of them was basically how last should the first be, or how first should the last be, sorry. And I think just off the back of what you've just said has made me think of another one, which is to account for that which can't be accounted for. I think that when these values were, first derived, which is obviously through, thousands of years of, tradition and history and, storytelling. And I think there was this very black and white view of the world that, there are men and then there are women, and there are women that do men things and there are men that do women things. But there was always like these categories that they could, everything could be named and categorized and sort of segmented. And that's an important part of biblical tradition, right? That's that ability to categorize and name things is so important. It's a really pivotal part of Genesis, when God gives Adam the responsibility of naming the animals. That's a huge responsibility for Adam, and it's a pivotal part in our human journey, because it basically demonstrates to us how God, intended to see humans as that which names and has dominion over, the animals of the world and etc. But one thing that's missing is this category of that which cannot be categorized, which you've just named, which is with the lichen, and then also like fishes that we've and then also religion that we can't categorize. And I think these examples are not important examples necessarily, but there are times where we're unable to categorize something where it does actually pose a problem. And I think this is, for example, like the whole transgender movement recently has been a whole issue because conservatives on the right would have a very black and white view of things, which which there's obviously good reasons for, good societal reasons for, but they also get it wrong, I think, when they're not able to allow for the possibility that there are people that I think I don't know, I it's just a belief that I have that there might be someone that's born with like a male physiology that genuinely believes that they are a girl, and that they're
intersex
female,
people
or
with more
intersex
than two
people.
chromosomes.
Exactly. And there's basically these cases where actually it is so ambiguous that to know where to categorize these. And I don't think that our culture has in its framework the ability to account for these extreme, ambiguous, uncategorizable situations.
It's kind of an interesting aspect of our culture that everything has to be categorizable, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, I don't know where it is. It's probably like a control thing, like a legibility thing, where it's like, in order to control things, you have to understand them. And in order to understand them, you have to collapse them into neat, discrete categories. And in order to do that, you have to, by definition, lose some of the resolution of what the actual thing on the ground is, because otherwise, nothing. Ultimately, you can like do this game where you get further and further down, where it becomes so ambiguous. Anything can become so ambiguous that it's impossible to work with.
I think another example when this comes up is basically, when does a fetus become a human, or an embryo become a human? Sorry, like at what point does that happen? That's extremely ambiguous, and is a huge point of contention, especially in the US. And if there was a way that we could understand that better, like understand that nuance better about like something that's so ambiguous and potentially just unknowable, then I think that it would make for a much more peaceful and prosperous conversation and civilization.
Yeah.
Cool. I need to got a dinner at 7 actually. I'm definitely going to be late for it. I've already texted him that I'm going to be late, but I was having too much fun with the conversation.
Yeah. Cool, man. Well, look, I'll send the recording across, but it's nice chatting.
That was good chat. I thought about things that I glad I talked about.